Good morning, physicians. Welcome to the next session on 21st century literature. After we have discovered the various literary devices, techniques, and elements, this time I will be discussing the various types of contexts. For our session learning targets, at the end of the session, you are expected to identify and explain the linguistic, sociocultural, biographical, and philosophical context and how they enhance the text's meaning and enrich readers' understanding. Situate the text in the context of the region and the nation, and explain the relationship of context with the text's meaning. So basically, the text meaning is not only enhanced by the use of literary devices, techniques, and elements, it is also improved by contexts. And today we will be having four important contexts in literature: linguistic context, sociocultural context, biographical context, and philosophical context. What is linguistic context that we're talking about? From the word linguist, language, it refers it refers to the language used by the writer. According to David Richter, practically everything we do that is specifically human is expressed in language. This is why literary text can be read through the context of the language used to write the text, as well as the way language is used in the text. So it refers to the language used by the writer. It also refers to the grammar or syntax or the structure of language used or present in the literary text. Now, if we are doing that, we are actually doing linguistic context. If we are analyzing a literary text according to its language, according to the way the language is used and structured in the text, that is what we call linguistic context. This literary reading adheres to Roland Barthes' famous maxim, "the author is dead." Reading through a linguistic context focuses on the language used in the literary work and how it is used to conveying the meaning. So, basically, we analyze the language used in the text to extract the meaning of the text. Now, why should we be reading literary text in the context of linguistic perspective? Here are some reasons why we should read literature through the linguistic context. Number one, reading the text on its own, regardless of the author's biography and sociocultural context, may help you understand the literary text through analyzing the word sentences, patterns, imagery, etc. of the text. So, more than just knowing the background information of the author, we use linguistic context especially in understanding the text through the words or the choice of words used by the author, the lengths of sentences used by the author, the patterns in structure, in grammatical structure of the text. That is how we read literary text through the eye of linguistic context. Another is analyzing the literary text grammar, syntax, or phonemic pattern may help you find the meaning of the text within its form and may help you interpret it by simply analyzing the content of the literary work. So it will be easy for us to analyze or to get the meaning of the text if we look closely at how the content of the work is written. And that refers to the grammar, to the syntax, to the grammatic structure of the text. Now, what are the specific strategies that we can perform when we read a text using linguistic context? Following strategies. Number one, analyze the diction or choice of words in the text. Did the author use a more formal choice of words, or did the author use a more informal, more conversational choice of words? Number two, examine the text syntax or use of sentences, clauses, phrases, etc. Did the author use complex sentences? Did the author use a combination of simple and compound sentences? Did the author use declarative sentences? Did the author use interrogative or exclamatory sentences? So it's really about analyzing the structure of sentences in a literary text when we talk of linguistic context. The third strategy is observe the use of figurative language. So, figurative language is still part of linguistic context. Even if figurative language is a literary device, it can still contribute to how the text is structured. Did the author use a lot of euphemisms? Did the author use a lot of similes and metaphors? Did the author use a lot of ironies in their sentences? So that is also a part of linguistic context. Another, analyze the mood and the tone of the text. Remember that the tone and mood is dictated by the choice of words in the text. So it's part of linguistic context. When we say mood, the way the choice of words created emotions in the reader. So if I am a reader and I read a text that uses a lot of negative words, negative sounding words, or negative related words, most probably I would feel negative emotions. So mood is part of linguistic context. The same with tone. When we say tone, it's on the part of the writer. Um, what is the attitude of the writer when he or she wrote the text? For example, if Edgar Allan Poe is famous for horror and morbid kind of short stories, you would know from his choice of words in his stories that maybe, probably, Edgar Allan Poe is also um, terrified or horrified in a way when he wrote the story because of the tone of the text. That is part of linguistic context. Another strategy is to observe the text overall structure. Okay? Did the author use simple sentences from the beginning up to the end of the story? Did the author use compound, complex sentences from the beginning up to the end of the story? Or did the author use a combination of all kinds of sentences and clauses and phrases in his or her story? So the overall structure of the text is also part of linguistic context. Lastly, another strategy is analyze the content of the text. Now, some major considerations when before you read a text in the lens of linguistic context, you have to take note of the following. Number one, even if literature uses language, it does not mean that the structure of literature and the language are the same. Some writers may not follow grammatical rules, and this kind of deviation may be used in your analysis. You may ask yourself this question: why is the text not following standard grammar? And other similar questions. For example, in poetry, most of the time you will read a lot of poems that do not follow the standard grammar in English. So why is that so? Could that be part of your interpretation? Definitely yes. Why is the poem not following the standard rules of grammar in English? That could be part of the way you interpret or analyze the poem. The second consideration is that the characteristics of the language in which the text was written may help in analyzing the text. You may also ask this question: why is the text written in this language? Is this considered a weak language or a strong language? And other similar questions. So the characteristics of a language may also help you in analyzing the text. Why is the text written that way? Why is the text written this way? Um, does the use of simple sentences contribute to a stronger language in the text, or does the use of complex sentences contribute to a weak language in the text? So you may ask those questions. The second context that we have here is sociocultural context, society and culture. So aside from understanding a literary text through the use of language, it is also important to note the year or period it was written. Readers would be able to identify the historical events that took place in that year. We would also find out the roots of an event's cause and the reasons behind the character's motives and interests. For example, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, it was written during the time of French Revolution. So how does Victor Hugo employ sociocultural context in developing the characters of Les Miserables? So if you're familiar with Les Miserables, um, the characters are living oppressed. They are suffering from a lot of injustices in the French society that time. So if we use sociocultural context, we will be able to understand better Les Miserables and how the characters are behaving in that novel, because we already know the sociocultural context behind the novel. According to the critic Wilbur Scott, art is not created in a vacuum. It is the work not simply of a person, but of an author fixed in time and space, answering a community of which he is an important articulate part. In reading, using the sociocultural context, you will examine the factors that affect the writing of the literary text and how the work was received by the readers during the time it was written. So, in sociocultural context, basically, the literary work is a product of history. It is a product of historical events that directly influence the writer in writing the literary work. Now, the question is, why is it important to read literary texts using the lens of sociocultural context? Reading using the sociocultural context helps you understand the social, economic, political, and cultural forces affecting the work that you are reading. So again, if I will be using Les Miserables, or if we will be using Noli Me Tangere by Jose Rizal, if you use sociocultural context, you will understand better Noli Me Tangere, because it was written at the time when Spaniards colonized the Philippines. So if you use sociocultural context in analyzing Noli Me Tangere, you would know that events in the Noli Me Tangere may also reflect the social conditions of the Philippines during the Spanish colonization. So that is what we call sociocultural context. Another reason is that analyzing the sociocultural context of the text makes you examine the role of the audience or the readers in shaping literature. So, for example, if you're born in the 20th century, for example, you're born in 2000s, and then you will be reading Noli Me Tangere that is published way in the past. So how you interpret the text may also contribute to how literature is shaped by your interpretations. Now, what are the strategies that we can perform when we analyze a text in the lens of a sociocultural context? These are the following strategies. Number one, what is the relationship between the characters or the speakers in the text and their society? So you may analyze the way the characters interact and the way the society influences their interaction, their behavior, their attitudes, their personalities in the text. Number two, does the text explicitly address issues of gender, race, or class? How does the text resolve these issues? So again, when we say sociocultural, it will also involve issues of gender, race, or social classes. Number three, who has the power, who does not? What is the reason for this setup? So when we say social classes also, we talk of a Marxist perspective wherein there is a struggle between the rich and the poor, the good and the bad. So the more powerful and the less powerful. So that's also part of social cultural context. Number four, how does this story reflect the nation? What does this say about the country and its inhabitants? So again, if you have read Noli Me Tangere, and if you use sociocultural context, what kind of Philippine society are we having? Did we have during that period when Noli Me Tangere was published? So if you use sociocultural context, you would discover what kind of nation, what kind of society it has when the literary work was published. Number five, who has the economic or social power? Is there oppression or class struggle? How do the characters overcome this? Does money or finances play a large role in the narrative? So again, when we talk of sociocultural context, there is the issue of power struggle. Who is more superior and who is more inferior? That is what we call power struggle or class struggle or economic or social power. Is there any violence or oppression present in the text? That's also part of sociocultural context. Number six, what is the prevailing social order? Does the story or poem accept or challenge it? So again, if we are talking about sociocultural context, we can also include the social order, how people are categorized in a society. For example, in India, right, there is what we call caste system. In our Philippine history, Filipinos are labeled Indio, the lowest class of society, right? So if you're analyzing the text using sociocultural context, these are the following questions that you should reflect on. Now, what is the major consideration when we read a text using sociocultural context or when we analyze a text using sociocultural context? You have to set aside your personal political philosophies or personal political ideologies. For example, if you're analyzing a literary text that centers on homosexuality, and you yourself you don't believe in homosexuality, so most probably you will be biased, you will be unfair in analyzing the literary text because your personal philosophy, your personal political stand on homosexuality is not in accordance with the literary text. So how do we avoid that? We have to set aside our personal ideologies when we analyze a text because once we once we um once we let our personal ideologies control our analysis, you may be overreading the text according to what you just believe, even if the text is not related to your political interest. So the better advice here is that do not do your best to be fair and not biased when analyzing a text. The third type of context that we have here is biographical. When we say biographical, we are actually analyzing the life story of the author, the background story, the background information regarding the author in order to analyze his or her work. For example, maybe in your previous English classes or Filipino classes, right? Before you discuss a story, your teacher will also ask you to get background information regarding the author, because sometimes the life of the author may also be an influence to why the author writes his or her literary piece. While it is important to know the characters in a literary text, it is also essential for readers to understand the author's background. Okay, so this is what we call biographical context. You are actually analyzing the author's background, which can help you interpret the literary text. Because once you understand the author's background, most probably you will be able to connect the characters and their principles to the life of the author. Sometimes you will be revealing patterns between the characters and the life story of the author. That is what we call biographical context. We get to know the author so that we could get to know better the characters in his or her story. And also, it may also allow us to get to know ourselves better as readers. Now, why is reading literature important in the lens of biographical context? Number one, understanding the author's life can help you understand his or her work thoroughly. So, there are literary works that may reveal connections, that may reveal important patterns or connections to the author's background. And reading the author's biography or autobiography helps you see how much his experience shaped his or her work directly and indirectly. For example, Jose Rizal wrote Noli Me Tangere at a younger age. How would that influence the quality of his work? How would his experiences in his life as a 30-year-old influence the quality of his literary work? So that is how we use biographical context. What are the strategies that we may employ when we analyze a text using biographical context? Following strategies. Research on what the author believes in and also what he or she does not. So when we get author's background, we have to get important, substantial information regarding the author. For example, his or her personal philosophies in life, his or her morals, what are his or her belief systems. Number two, analyze how the author's belief system is reflected in his or her work. Because once we know the author's philosophical, personal, political, philosophical ideologies, we may be able to find that in his or her literary work. Third, look at the author's other works and analyze if there is a pattern with regard to the theme that is indicative of his or her life and beliefs. So, we we may use biographical context in comparing other works from the same author, and it may allow us to reveal important patterns, especially to the theme of his or her works, that may be a manifestation, that may be a reflection of his or her personal beliefs in his or her life. Now, what are the important considerations, reminders, when we read or analyze a text using biographical context? Number one, you should not assume that all works are confessional, biographical, or even true to life. So that is the danger of biographical context. We may assume that everything that happened in the story also happened in the real life of the author. That's not the point of biographical context. So do not assume that when the author wrote this story, he or she is making a confession. That's not precisely the point of biographical context. Number two, a literary text is according to the author's perspective and will be heavily influenced by him or her. But it is not the only way of studying literature. So again, just because you know the background of the author does not mean that it is the best and the only way of analyzing literature. No, that's not the case because we still have linguistic context. We still have sociocultural context. So biographical context is just one way of studying literature. The last context that we have here is what we call philosophical context. When we say philosophical context, we are actually talking about questions that have captivated humanity's attention ever since we became prosperous enough to have the time and energy to think about these questions. For example, what is the nature of the universe? And what is the individual's proper response to the universe? These are the two major questions when we talk of philosophical context. The first category, metaphysics, are secondary questions about whether it has a purpose or meaning, if the universe ever didn't exist, or if the universe will ever stop existing, or if the universe had a creator, or whether the universe is still involved or interested, and whether universe is benign, malefic, or indifferent. Any questions you can imagine by replacing the word universe with something else. For example, humanity, life, death, thought, love, God, nature, time, and so on. So when we say philosophical context, these are the deep conversations that we have, questioning why universe is like this, questioning your own purpose as a human being, that will fall under philosophical context. The second category, which is ethics, are all questions of morality and behavior, pleasure and pain, faith and free will, kindness and cruelty, and anything else concerning human actions. So when we talk of philosophical context, we're actually talking about virtues, values in life, morals in life. That is what we call philosophical context. Now, why is it important to read or analyze literary texts in the lens of philosophical context? What are the specific strategies that we can employ when we analyze a text using philosophical context? Number one, determine which philosophical trends the author admires and which he or she is rejecting. So, you have to find out the author's philosophy in life. Which are the ones he or she firmly believes in, and which are the ones he or she firmly rejects. Number two, find at least one work that explains the philosopher's ideas, whether it is written by the philosopher or by someone else. There are a lot of philosophers all throughout history until today. And all these philosophers have each of their contributions that shape the literature today. So that can be a strategy in analyzing a text by adapting a philosopher's idea in order to analyze a text. Now, what is the major reminder when we analyze a text using philosophical context? Remember that philosophy is an activity of the intellect where, using argument and clarification, we strive to reach conclusions about the nature of existence. It employs discussion and debate to build on past argument. So it's really comprehensive. If you look at the way philosophical context is presented, it is more deep. It is deeper than linguistic, sociocultural, and biographical context. Philosophical context is goes beyond intelligence. It's about questioning our existence as human beings. That is what we call philosophical context. Now, to sum it up, text would refer to the words which are written, while context is the surroundings of the text, whether it is created within the text or describing the situation of the author's life in which the text was written. So when we talk of text, basically when we talk of text, we are referring to all the forms of text that we are reading and analyzing, whether it's a book, poem, short stories, novels. The context would refer to the surroundings of the text. When we say surroundings of the text, it may be about the language used in the text or the historical event that influenced the text or the kind of society, the kind of life the author had when he or she wrote the text. That is what we call context. We have four types of context. We have linguistic context. When we say linguistic context, again, we are looking into the discourse that surround the language used in the author in order to interpret the characters and the overall meaning or message of the text. Sociocultural context would talk about the society in which the literary work is written. Now, what about the society? It may be about the strengths, weaknesses, and the changes occurring in that society during a specific period in which the literary work is published, and then the connection or the relationship of that society and that period when the text is written. That is what we call sociocultural context. We also have biographical context. When we talk of biographical context, we are actually analyzing, understanding the author's background and his or her perspective. The last context that we had is philosophical context, which focuses on deeper ideas or deeper themes, views of the world, moral statements, and the author's philosophy. Usually also, philosophical context would center on the good and the evil of the society or of the world or of the universe. That is under philosophical context. Now, why are we learning context in this subject? Why is it important to recognize the various types of context? Because if we know the context, it bridges the gap between the authors and the readers. If we know the context as readers, we would better understand and we would better interpret the text once we figure out the context behind the text. That is how important learning context is. It is not enough to know what the story is all about. It's also important that we as readers need to know the context behind the text overall meaning.